Alright, so we have our tank bottom here. It is all nice and cured and shiny. This is looking really good. And today we will actually get to fiberglass this. So I'm going to need to sand this down again and clean it with Xylol to prep it. But before we do that, while it's all nice and shiny and smooth, I'm going to go ahead and cut out the fiberglass that we're going to use. Alright, so basically all I did was cut out some fiberglass that is a little bit bigger than this piece of wood, and we will just fiberglass this in place just like this. This roll of fiberglass I'm using because it was free. I did not have to buy this fiberglass, so it's just standard woven fiberglass, and it's good for stuff like this. Like, there's nothing wrong with using it for something like this. Woven is not super strong, but since we're using it to coat a piece of wood, it doesn't need to be. The wood is what's going to provide the strength here. This is really just for protection, since the bottom, this is the bottom right here, this is going to be the top of the chain locker, and I imagine that the chain is going to be scraping all up against it. And then of course the tank is going to be fiberglass, so we will also do this side, and it will just provide some extra stiffness for the rest of the tank. Alright, so we've got the fiberglass cut, and now we're going to sand this to prep it so that we can epoxy in the fiberglass. Done sanding, and we've wiped this down with Xylol. So now what we're going to do is mix up a batch of epoxy and wet out our fiberglass and fiberglass it down here. So the first thing we want to do is wet out the surface that we're going to be putting the fiberglass on. Okay, so I've got that pretty close to all the edges. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the notch side of this to make sure it's evenly spread out. Okay, and now I'm going to grab the fiberglass and we're going to lay it down. Alright, so just using this epoxy roller here to roll out any air bubbles. This fiberglass is actually really thick and hard to work with, and it wants to kind of tent up. But then you also have, working with any fiberglass, you have the tendency as the epoxy cures for these very shallow, small air pockets to build up. And what that will result in is the fiberglass not adhering to the substrate in that area. So you'll basically have an air pocket that you'll have to grind out and then re-fiberglass, and it's no fun. I had to do that several times after we record the deck, and it's a pain. So it is worth your while to sit here for a little while with one of these guys and just watch. And if you see any of those little air pockets starting to form, just gently roll it out real quick so that you don't have those problems after it cures. You have to grind it out and start all over. It's no fun. But yeah, it's looking pretty good. This fiberglass is definitely not easy to work with, but that's okay. Looks like it's going to work really well. Alright, so this has been sitting out in the sun while I was up on the foredeck sanding, and it's not fully cured, but I mean it's pretty close. So I figured I would take some time to trim off the little bit of excess that we have here. Alright, so this morning I came out here very early again, right as the sun was rising, and decided to watch some nature. I saw 10 deer and 4 coyotes. It was really crazy. The coyotes, 2 of them, actually came up behind me, and they didn't know I was there because I'm up on my boat and they don't really think to look up here. But yeah, they came up behind me and I saw them come out of the corner of my eye, and I went up, I was looking out of the port light, and I went up on deck, and they were very close, maybe 100 feet, and I actually called out to one of them, and he was confused, and he finally looked up and saw me. But he was big. I mean, this thing looked like a German Shepherd. I was really surprised. So anyhow, that was pretty cool. And then they went out and laid in the field pretty far away, maybe 150 yards away. And they just laid there for a really long time. It was strange. I've never seen coyotes just laying out in the field. But yeah, the deer even went right up to them, and they just kind of laid there and looked at each other, and then the deer went off, and then about 20 or 30 minutes later, the coyotes went off into the woods. So anyhow, that was neat. So this is fully cured, and we're going to wipe it down with Silol, sand off these edges here, and then fiberglass the other side. So go ahead and wipe it down. Got a comment from a viewer who suggested that I should always be wearing gloves when working with Zylol, and he's right. I sometimes forget to do that, but now that someone has pointed it out, I'm always going to remember, so thank you for that. Zylol is pretty nasty stuff. It can, apparently I've heard that it can actually like melt through fiberglass. Some people don't keep it on their boat because they're worried that, you know, if it ever leaked or something, it could just like eat a hole. I don't know if it's really that crazy, but it definitely does degrade the fiberglass. Well, the epoxy, not necessarily the fiberglass. The fiberglass is fine. But here again, we're just de-waxing. So this is like really slippery, waxy, and that blush will prevent other layers being adhered properly. It also helps to get rid of that before you sand. See how yellow that is? But I'm really happy to say there are no bubbles in this fiberglass. So that's great. Looks like it adhered really well. Alright, so basically we're just going to sand off the edges here. You can kind of see where the fiberglass just extends a little bit past. And once we get that sanded down flush, I'm going to touch up a few areas here where the epoxy dripped down, and then we'll fiberglass this side. Alright, so this is nice and sanded, and you can see no more fiberglass coming off the sides there. So now what we'll do is go ahead and wipe the whole thing down with Xylol again, and then fiberglass this side. Okay, so I just wet this out, and I'm going to do something a little bit different with this side. Since the last time I noticed that the fiberglass is so rigid, I mentioned that it was kind of wanting to tent up, and I'm going to have to get it around these contours, which I'm anticipating is going to be a little bit more difficult than if it were not so thick of a fiberglass. So now that it's wetted out, I'm going to mix up another batch of epoxy with some silica in it, and what that's going to do is I'll lay the thickened epoxy down and put the fiberglass on that, and it's going to help it adhere a little bit more so that I can make sure those corners are good to go. Okay, so what I've done here is we sanded everything down, wiped it down with Xylol, wetted it out with epoxy, then mixed up some thickened epoxy with colloidal silica, and the reason why we did that is because it's just a little bit thicker and stickier, and so the fiberglass would adhere better to this radius. And then I laid it down upside down. I wet out the epoxy, or I wet out the fiberglass with the thickened epoxy. I flipped it so the thickened epoxy was down, and then I mixed up another batch of just normal epoxy, unthickened, and I wet out the remainder of the fiberglass and started pushing these edges down. And then I took some of this vacuum bagging cloth and I laid it on top, and I've weighted it down to try to get that fiberglass to adhere to that radius. Like I said before, it's really thick fiberglass. It does not like to bend and stay there, so it's not the best for this, but we'll see how this works.